Thank you very much indeed. It's a delight to welcome you here today at our webinar on graphite materials. We're working together with Volt Resources on this and with DGWA. We're just letting a few more people into the webinar, so whilst the people are starting to come into the webinar, just give you a little bit of a background on the German Australian Business Council and our other business councils throughout Europe. So the German Australian Business Council is now almost 25 years old. We were set up in order to promote business between Germany and Australia, and we work together with a network of other business councils throughout Europe under the banner of Australian Business in Europe. We've been extremely pleased to welcome DGWA from Frankfurt as one of our members for several years now, and I'm sure Matthew Reynolds will tell us a little bit more about what DGWA has been doing when I pass over to him in a couple of minutes. But first of all, I want to welcome you to this webinar, which is the very first webinar in our being coordinated by our raw materials focus group within the German Australian Business Council. As some of you know, the European Union has identified raw materials as being absolutely critical to the European economy over the next few years. Obviously, some of the major suppliers of raw materials are in Africa and in China, countries in which there are, to put it mildly, challenges and ethical issues in extracting those materials. But of course, Australia, as well as other like-minded countries, also do have quite nice resources that we can use. And one of the things that we want to do within the German Australian Business Council in the next few months is to look at the opportunities that are open to European and to Australian businesses to improve the relationships, the economic and the personal social relationships between our two great countries. So with that introduction, I just wanted to highlight this webinar will be recorded. If you do not want your name to appear on the recording or your face to appear on the recording, please rename yourself so that you will not be identifiable on the recording, and please turn off your camera if you do not want people to see you. So with that, I will pass over to Matthew Reynolds to introduce a little bit about what DGWA is doing and what Volt Resources is doing. So Matthew, over to you.
Thanks, Robert, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. So my name is Matthew Reynolds. I work with DGWA here in Frankfurt, Germany. DGWA is a boutique investment bank. We assist Australian and global companies connect and engage with European investors and stakeholders. So as an Australian working in Germany, it's incredibly exciting to see Australian companies working in the critical raw materials supply chain in Europe. As Robert mentioned, 5 years ago, no one was talking about raw materials, and now the conversation is everywhere, from world leaders to business to stakeholders. So it's a really incredibly exciting place to be at the moment. And there's real immediacy and urgency to these discussions. So as I said, what we do in Germany is we help Australian companies over here connect and engage with European investors. And there's a surprisingly large number of Australian companies working in Europe. Volt Resources, of course, our company we're talking to today, they have a very large graphite reserve in the Ukraine, and they're also exploring strategic opportunities for battery anode development also in Europe. There's Neo Metals that we work with as well, which is developing probably a global leader in battery recycling technology. And it also has a vanadium project in Finland. There's Eclipse Metals, which has got some very exciting rare earth projects in Greenland, and Prospect, which is developing projects in Finland and Slovakia. So it's just a few. And as I said, it's this Australian willingness to, I think, take risks with exploration and production capabilities and sort of reach out across the globe that I think is really important for Europe as it seeks to meet its zero emission targets and to also meet its requirements under the EU Critical Raw Materials Act. And these companies, including Volt, are very well supported by Australian and also global investors. And that's something that we work very closely with them over here in Europe. And since we started working with Volt in 2021, it's definitely probably one of the most traded dual-listed shares in Germany. It's engaged incredibly strongly with the European retail investment market, and it's probably one of the most traded dual-listed shares on the German exchanges. Volt Resources, as Prashant and Trevor will probably tell you, that it's also engaged very strongly with EU agencies such as the EIT Raw Materials Alliance and European EIT Raw Materials. And our company's facilitated discussions in these areas as well. In terms of the tailwinds for companies like Volt in Europe, there's some, they're incredibly strong. We're seeing legislative tailwinds such as the EU Critical Raw Materials Act, which is going to require diversification of supply, which is a big positive for companies like Volt that are operating in the graphite space, where graphite traditionally coming in from Europe is synthetic graphite out of China. There's the battery passport legislation, which is going to require that every physical battery have a digital twin, and that digital twin will have to have details around the CO2 footprint of the whole supply chain, and also the CO2 emissions that have gone into that battery. And finally, of course, Europe's going to ban sale of petrol and diesel engines by 2035. So all these legislative changes will provide, we think, massive tailwinds for companies like Volt Resources in Europe. So in conclusion, it's a great time for companies such as Volt Resources to be engaging in Europe, and for investors and stakeholders to closely follow the narrative and the strategy, and to sort of follow these companies on their journey. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Matthew, for that introduction to the activities that you're working on. The way we're going to run this webinar is the following. I'm going to ask questions for each of the participants, and after the first question, I'll ask them if they could just briefly introduce themselves. For those of you, probably most of us are now very, very familiar with Zoom, but remind you that we have the questions and answer session, which is down at the bottom, roughly in the middle. If you could put your questions into that area, not into the chat, well, that would be grateful, and we'll try and handle them at the end. We hope to have about 20 minutes just to handle general questions. We're not going to take interventions from the floor during this webinar, so please don't try and raise your hand or something like that. This is just to make it move very effectively. And finally, another reminder that we are recording this webinar. If you do not want your name to appear or your video to appear, then please do not do that. So the first question I'd like to ask is to Prashant. So Prashant, it's a great honor for you to actually come to join us today. I wonder if you could firstly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what graphite is and what its importance is for modern industry. I guess many of us, had their first experience with the so-called lead pencils, which actually had graphite in them at school. Some of them use them obviously to help with lubrication in our doors at home and the things like that. But I know that graphite is much, much more important than that. So if I could hand over to Prashant for a brief introduction and just tell us a little bit what graphite is and why it's so important to the world.
Absolutely.
Prashant.
Good afternoon, Robert. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And I want to echo Matthew's point. This is an exciting time to be in the electric vehicle, battery materials, clean tech industry. This is really amazing time where you have all the legislative forces, the financial forces, and of course, the Mother Nature wants clean solutions. So let's all work together. This is a win-win-win situation. So maybe I can spend 30 seconds introducing myself. My name is Prashant Chintawar. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Volt Resources. We are a company listed both on ASX, Australian Stock Exchange, and FRA, Frankfurt Exchange. My background is primarily in battery materials, electric vehicles, and specialty chemical industry. In fact, I started working in electric vehicles even when that industry was pretty much nascent, almost an emerging industry back in late 90s. And my qualifications is actually in PhD in chemical engineering, and I have a track record of starting, creating, and dramatically scaling up businesses such as the specialty chemicals and battery materials, and also running large product management P&L centers. So coming to your question, Robert, you're absolutely right. All of us essentially got introduced to graphite when we started using HB or 2H pencils. And actually, that's the similar graphite that we're using, but I think there's a lot of differences between that graphite versus what we need to use in the electric vehicles. So just to put things in perspective, the lithium-ion batteries are really at the heart of this EV revolution. And these batteries contain graphite as a key ingredient, as what is called as an anode material. In fact, these batteries contain, I would say, anywhere from 7 to 10 times more graphite than lithium. So you may even want to start calling them graphite batteries. Graphite is actually also critical raw material, both in US and in Europe. And if you look at today's situation, China produces about 70% of the world's natural graphite and over 95% of global natural graphite anode. So the graphite that comes out of mine has to be refined, has to be chemically converted into what is called as a graphite anode. And as I said, China has over 95% of the global market share today. So with the expected growth of electric vehicles, it's absolutely necessary for Europe to secure the supplies of graphite. And that's where the world subsidiary, Zavalensky Graphite, comes into the picture.
So that's fantastic. I hadn't realized that China had such a domination of the marketplaces until now. I'm going to ask Trevor a question, and Trevor, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Perth today, Perth, Western Australia today. A brief introduction about yourself. And it's my understanding, Trevor, that you were actually instrumental in the original acquisition of the Zavalensky graphite business in the Ukraine. Could you please tell us a little bit more about the history of the mine and how you see the mine now fitting into the EU critical raw material stream in the future? Trevor, over to you.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Robert. And yeah, that's correct. Back in in fact, it was 2020 when I first got introduced to the opportunity to have a look at the acquisition of an interest or shareholding in Zavalensky. The appealing part of that opportunity was the fact that it had been in operation since 1934. So very long-term production, highly experienced workforce because of the, the multi-decade nature of the operations. And you mentioned, I think earlier on, the size of the resource. Zavalensky is based on Russian code resources. So this is still some work that we plan to do, is to convert it into one of the more understood sort of reporting codes like JORC in Australia for resource definition. But in the Russian code, it's well over 100 million tonnes of graphite ore there in the Zavalensky deposits. So what you're looking at is the opportunity for a business that is already, in European terms, the largest producer of graphite in Europe and has been on and off for a number of years. Europe's actual requirements going forward, though, is pretty significant. I'll just touch on that in a minute. But so the opportunity for Zavalensky is to not only stabilise its production. Obviously, the situation in Ukraine's been pretty volatile over the last couple of years, and that's probably held up our ability to advance the Zavalensky project and the mine as much as we would like to, because of the obviously the Russian invasion and the disruption that's caused. But the opportunity for Zavalensky in terms of the supply of graphite into Europe is pretty clear. It's got a great, it's got very good logistics. So access into Europe is really strong in terms of rail and road connections. As I mentioned, it's the largest graphite resource in Europe, and the opportunity to expand production and be a key supplier into the developing lithium-ion battery market and other battery technologies for that matter is pretty clear. So when you have a look at, in fact, just last week, the European Raw Materials Alliance classified Zavaleski as one of 50 key strategic projects or assets in Europe for the critical materials supply chain. And the demand in Europe is forecast to be, for graphite alone, by 2030 is 1.5 million tonnes required to supply the battery industry in Europe. So when you think that current production's less than 20,000 tonnes per annum, that's a long way to go for graphite supply to try and, be a part of that in Europe. So, I think the forecast by 2030 is that European supply might be about 20% of that total amount. So Europe's still going to have to look externally to other projects, in other countries for the supply of graphite. But clearly, Zavaleski's got a fantastic opportunity to be one of the key suppliers in Europe for graphite material for lithium-ion batteries. So yeah, and that's pretty much explained. Obviously, we've got Roman on the call as well, and he can talk a lot more about Zavaleski as well. But that just gives you a bit of insight into the decision there. So and we acquired a 70% shareholding in the business, and we obviously look forward to working with the Zavaleski management team and making progress with our plans for this business.
Thanks very much indeed. I think it's an exciting time, and I'm going to ask Roman. Roman's got a really interesting background. We were just having a little bit of a chat before we started the webinar. So, Roman, maybe I'll ask you to just give a short version of what your background and how you came to be involved in Zavaleski. And then I think one of the things that's really going to interest those listening and watching this webinar is just what it's like to be running a critical raw materials business in Ukraine at present. What has been the major challenges? I say most of us are in Western Europe listening to this, so we get fairly regular updates from Kiev on something. But what's really happening on the ground, I think, is pretty unknown to the majority of us. So, Roman, give a bit of your background and then maybe just tell us a little bit what it's like within the business at present or within the country, and how you're working on the mine. So thanks very much, Roman.
Yeah, thank you, Robert, very much for this opportunity to take part in this webinar. So I'm joined Zavaleski Graphite and Wold Group in the end of 2021. Before joining Wold, I was working for more than 2 years for the government of Ukraine as the deputy head of the State Geology Service of Ukraine. There was in charge of the mining licenses and the exploration of the minerals on the territory of Ukraine. And I also achieved, and this is among also what I achieved, is that securing the memorandum for the strategic partnership between European Union and Ukraine for the critical supply of critical minerals and batteries. So that was my start, and I'm very happy to promote this memorandum and to implement this memorandum, already working for the Zavaleski and Wold within the supply of the graphite. So yes, Wold in 2021 came with the once purchased the company came with the robust program for the further investment and enhancing our assets. But unfortunately, the war introduced some challenges in that process, and the company met the challenges in 2022. So there was some disruption in the supply chain of the materials, since for our production and our flotation process, we use a number of materials which we need to source from different places, so like metallic balls, sodium silicate, phosphor. By the way, phosphor was one of the challenges that we needed to achieve and to resolve in 2022. All the history before, Zavalevsky used a Russian sourced phosphor called Oxal T92, and that's jointly understood that after the big war began, we could not use the Russian products, so we sourced and was testing for the phosphor from the different parts of the world. We tested the phosphor from Australia, from China, from Europe, and finally we opted for us a product from Europe, which is slightly more expensive, but anyway, nothing to do with that. But on the other hand, this is exactly that's called creating a supply chain between Ukraine and Europe. So we supply graphite to Europe, and we purchase some materials needed for our processing in Ukraine. Also, we had some challenges with the drafting our people into the military. So our management team tried to work robustly with the local labor market to meet our needs and to have enough people for running the business. We are quite okay with that. The winter was also a challenge for us, since in autumn there started a number of the missiles attack, and there was disruption in electricity grid, and even if we wanted to produce, was no power to run the business. But fortunately, from the March of this year, situation changed. We have enough of power, and we started our first production campaign in April, and already produced 1,000 tons of the graphite, met our target. So we come up with some conservative approach for this year 2023, with a conservative production campaign, which consists with the 3 turns in each quarter. So we successfully ran our first production campaign. We stopped for the maintenance, and we are preparing for our next campaign, which should be in July or August.
When you talk about a campaign, what do you actually mean by a campaign, Roman? So that's so for some of our listeners won't be familiar with sort of some of the mining technology. So maybe just explain what you mean by a campaign.
So generally, company normally works each month, but due to the challenges we have within the war time, we have some problems with the supply of the materials. We have some problems with the working capital. So we minimize our production volumes and put them in some stages and prepare and gather all the materials needed for the run.
Okay, fine. So thanks for that. That's absolutely superb. And actually, Prashant, maybe you could just highlight something. You issued a press release last week on the Australian Stock Exchange, talking about the restarting the operations and the new campaign, which Roman has just mentioned. Could you just talk us through where you see this from a management point of view, how things are going to develop in the next few months? Over to you, Prashant.
Right. Thank you, Robert. So I want to kind of extend the chain of thought that Roman started. So typically mining operation or any industrial operation, as long as there is a demand, you want to run it as much as you can, correct? You want to run it either 24/7, 24/5, and roughly 350 days a year. But as you know, unfortunately, the geopolitical situation in Ukraine remains very fragile. And this started back in obviously February of last year. So if you look at the Zelensky's production pre-invasion from 2017 to 2021, we were producing about 7,500 tons per annum of graphite product. Unfortunately, that number dipped to only 846 tons last year, 2022. So what we did, we challenged Roman and his team, the Zelensky management team at the beginning of the year to come up with a plan which produces significantly more quantity than 846 with reasonable assurance that yes, we can execute that plan because as he articulated, the supply chain still remains fragile. There are power shutdowns and not everything is within our control. So I'm really delighted to inform the audience that after the winter shutdown, his team was able to restart the operation in the middle of April. And that was a campaign. So you essentially start, stop, and after a certain time, you restart the operation. So his team was able to produce during this campaign, which started about 3-4 weeks ago now, more than 1,000 tons. And then we plan to actually have 2 additional campaigns in the 3rd quarter of 2023 and the 4th quarter of 2023. So the goal is to produce at least 1,000 tons in each of these campaigns. And not to reemphasize, but not to elaborate, it's very important for the audience to understand that despite all the situation on the ground, our team is safe in Ukraine, our assets are safe, equally important. But the team has really rose to the challenge. There are a lot of issues there, and they really actually successfully executed that campaign. Yeah. So 1,000 ton production may not sound a whole lot, but the reality is in Europe, as Trevor articulated, we are one of the largest or maybe the largest operating graphite mine. So we definitely need all the support, financial, legislative, moral support from everyone in Europe in order for us to actually continue to produce and eventually dramatically boost the production, because this plant is not really currently operating at the capacity, nowhere close to that. Yeah. So in fact, we want to significantly ramp up the production and meet the local demand for this material.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's very interesting, Prashant, and both Roman and you have highlighted the team aspect here. And I know from some Ukrainian friends near where I live, they are working quite normally, often remotely working for companies still based in Ukraine. But they say it's the worry, the tremendous worry. Most of them have had family members, nieces, nephews, sons, daughters conscripted into the Ukrainian forces, and some of them have unfortunately disappeared. So it must be a tremendous amount of pressure that the team is working under. So it's hats off to you. Matthew, let's just go back. You mentioned right at the beginning that Volt is one of the few dual listed companies on both the German stock exchange and the Australian stock exchange. Maybe just what is dual listing? Could you just explain it for those of people who are a little bit unfamiliar, and maybe give us an indication? Is there been significant European investor interest in Volt's activities? Matthew, just pass over to you on that one.
Thanks, Robert. So there's actually quite a number of dual listed companies from the ASX that are listed on the German exchanges. So I'll just briefly explain what it means. So if a company is trading on the ASX, the Frankfurt Stock Exchange considers that a recognized global exchange. So they will list the company shares on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. And it's a relatively simple process. There's no administrative or compliance costs. And the big benefit of that for companies like Volt is it allows European investors to participate in the company, to buy shares relatively low cost in Europe and without exchange risks. So they can buy off many of the apps. So in Europe, there's apps like Trade Republic and others that allow very easy for European investors to trade the shares. So it facilitates companies like Volt, enabling them to have a global investor base. And the benefits of that are you broadens your investor base around the world. You have engaged investors, and specifically for companies like Volt, with a European project such as the Ukraine, and a European strategy to provide battery anode material. This is something that retail investors in Europe follow very closely, and they are able to, through the dual listing process, they're able to buy shares in Europe. So yes, I think it's been a real positive for Volt. As I said, since we're working, we've seen a significant increase in their in the European shareholder base, and these, the German investors are very passionate, and they follow the company on the equity sites, and they discuss the company and its operations, and I think that's a positive for companies. An engaged investor base that's globally participates in the activities of the company, I think, can only be a positive.
Right. No, I think that's very interesting, and it's interesting as you were talking about how easy it is to buy for Europeans now to buy. I was just looking at Trade Republic on my phone, and I was able to I could purchase whilst we're talking sort of Volt Resources
Yes.
shares if I'd wanted to. So I hadn't realised just how easy it is, this dual listing that's is going to happen. Prashant, we've talked a lot about the Ukrainian situation. We've talked about the earlier parts that what's coming out of Ukraine will actually be only part of the European supply. Where's the rest of the supply coming from? Is Volt Resources looking at other sources of graphite around the world, or more in Europe or in the Ukraine? Maybe you could just give us some indication, as far as you can, obviously, of your future plans in graphite, or is it you're just focusing on the mine in the Ukraine?
No, that's a good question, Robert. So let me actually give kind of a two-part answer to that question. First is kind of what's the demand versus supply situation specifically for the European market, and then what is Volt's global strategy beyond the project, beyond the mine, beyond the operating mine that we have in Ukraine. So just to put things in perspective, a typical electric vehicle contains anywhere from 50 to 60 kilowatt hour of a lithium-ion battery pack. So you're looking at roughly 50 to 60 kilogram of graphite. And even if you assume half of that is synthetic graphite, half of that being a natural graphite, you're looking at 25 kilograms of graphite in each car, natural graphite. And now compare that with the actual production we have from the Ukrainian mine, 7,500 tons per annum. What it tells us is the current graphite production in Europe is not even sufficient for producing 200,000 of electric vehicles. I'm almost certain the market is much, much larger than that. So there's a significant demand versus supply gap. And obviously, Ukraine, our Zavalensky graphite is one part of the solution, but I presume that this is actually not the only solution. We definitely will be ramping up the capacity, both on the graphite side and the graphite anode side in the European market, but we definitely also want other players to come participate in this growth story. Okay. So what is Volt's strategy beyond Ukraine? So I like to think that we're kind of very lucky, we're blessed. We had two high-quality graphite assets. The one is in Ukraine, that's been in operation since 1934, and another project is in Tanzania which is 100% owned by Volt as of now. So we plan to bring that online starting 2025, 2026 timeframe, and it will be brought online in two stages. The stage one will be about 24,000 tons of graphite. And as of now, we have already secured binding offtakes for that 24,000 tons of graphite. And then the stage two would be between 170 to 200,000 tons of graphite, which will come online about 2027 timeframe. So at that capacity of 170 to 200,000 tons, it will be one of the largest graphite assets in the world. So we want to be really truly known as the graphite anode company. our strategy is very simple. We want to focus only on few things, which is graphite and graphite anode material. They're both connected, very intimately connected. We only want to focus on Europe and North American market. And that's our struggle. That's our strategy. That's how we want to go after the market. So again, this is really all about cooperation, competitive cooperation, because if you really look at the kind of a side note over here, if you look at the gist of the success for the Asian lithium-ion battery industry, which is more than almost 31 years old now, which started back in Japan in 1992, it's really this whole creation of the entire ecosystem, not only the battery, but the battery guys, pack manufacturers, critical raw material producers. They all are working in one ecosystem to ensure the joint success. And I hope we can replicate the same story, both Europe and in North America.
That's actually fantastic as well. Trevor, so we talked a little bit about the European Raw Materials Alliance, and I think that Matthew or yourself said how supportive that the European Union has been. Where do you see the relationships with the EU agencies going in future? How are you going to start interacting with the Critical Raw Materials Act? Maybe you could give a little bit of your thoughts from the side of Volt Resources.
Yeah, sure. I guess, as soon as we actually invested in Ukraine and in the Zabaleski business, we joined the European Battery Alliance and also the European Raw Materials Alliance, which are both agencies within the European Union for developing the critical minerals and battery. And a key part of that is the battery material supply chain. So part of that facilitation is, or part of the services that those agencies provide is, to assist companies to develop their businesses, develop their supply chains, their strategic partnerships. So consequently, they can assist in introducing investors, introducing finance, introducing customers, strategic customers. So these could be car OEMs or battery manufacturers, and also assisting in the facilitation for your expansion plans and these sorts of aspects. One of the things I guess that we're still pulling together is what is the overall outlook for the Zabaleski business. Obviously, we see really strong demand growth in Europe for graphite materials for the EV market and stationary storage as well for in terms of battery usage. Because of the large resource base, and I mentioned over 100 million tonnes of ore, the project grades around 6.5 to 7% graphite or TGC. So when you multiply that by over 100 million tonnes, you can see there's probably 6.5 to 7 million tonnes of graphite in Zabaleski. So producing at 7,500 tonnes per annum doesn't make a lot of economic sense. So obviously one of the things that we'll be looking at is when the time is right and when investments will come to the project, and obviously we need some stability in Ukraine for that to occur. But the opportunities to expand production out of Ukraine significantly, and here we're not set yet on what that number will be, but clearly you increase production to say 100,000 tonnes a year of graphite, and you would still have over 60 years of graphite supply based around the resource base. So those are sort of opportunities that will require a large amount of investment. But when you think that Europe is going to need around about 1.5 million tonnes of natural graphite by the end of this decade to meet its requirements for battery production, then lithium-ion battery production, then see the size of the opportunity.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's, the opportunity is obviously massive. Just remind people if they have a question to put it into the Q&A section here. And I'll take the opportunity to actually go back to Roman on to answer one of the questions here, because we've talked about the opportunities in Zawierski, and Roman also mentioned that during the winter period you'd had to cease operations. I guess it was probably because of cold, inclement weather. I don't know whether it snows. Oh, by the way, somebody sent me a message saying, whereabouts is the mine actually in the Ukraine? I know it's down near the Moldovan border, so maybe you could highlight that just a little bit more, Roman, where you're actually located. The question is, will there always have to be a winter shutdown, or was this just because of the special circumstances? Are you actually able midterm to consider a year-round mining? So Roman, over to you. Maybe quick, whereabouts are you actually based? At the mine based, obviously you're in Kyiv today, and then will there always be a winter shutdown, or will you be able to do all year-round mining in the future? Roman.
So thank you, Robert, for the question. So historically, before Zawierski graphite, for the last decades, they did not work in winter due to the negative temperature. But first, the situation changed. We see the last year that the weather in the winter in Europe zone is getting more warm and warm. So this year we even didn't see the temperatures below -10. So generally quite moderate winter. And the reason we did not work this winter was majority was electricity shutdown and the grid destroyed. So we know how to cope with this issue. Working for the winter, we have two solutions. One is we call quick wins, very cost effective, just changing the angle of the pipe, and with this kind of the moderate winter, we keep producing. But for the longer term, we will need slightly more investments in changing the pipe, changing the metal pipe to the new composite plastic pipe, which has totally different performance. And I think in the next year we already can, once let's say, I assume that we will win the war, and the next year we can try to work already in winter. And the next story is everything about investment.
Okay, no, that's very interesting. Yes, and I think we'll keep on coming back to the investment. And in fact, there's one interesting question that occurs, which is Australia has often been criticised that it's been just an exporter of the raw materials, and much of the value is actually being added outside of Australia, the processing of the minerals and the conversion into final products. And I think that's possibly a question to Prashant, which is that I know you've talked, I think publicly talked about developing a battery anode plant in Europe. How do you actually see retaining much more of the value within Ukraine, within Europe, from the mined graphite, and where do you see Volt Resources playing a role? Prashant, over to you.
Okay, that's a good question. So the simple answer to that question, Robert, is we follow our customers. And our customers are essentially the battery manufacturers, the cell manufacturers, and there's been multiple public announcements, especially for the European continent. You have Northvolt, we have Freyr, which are really domestic manufacturers, plus some other Asian manufacturers which are setting up their battery production facilities in Europe. It goes without saying that we have to be really geographically close because of the legislation, because of also the actual practical aspects of running this industry. And as I was alluding to, the part of the reason these Asian manufacturers have dominated this industry is really this creation of this ecosystem where all are working together as one unit in order to make the whole industry successful. So We have already announced that we plan to have a European natural graphite anode plant, which will probably rely on the graphite coming from Roman's asset in Ukraine. So we are going to use the European graphite, convert it in Europe into the natural graphite anode, which will be sold to the battery companies which are setting up operations in Europe as we speak. So we announced this relationship with the company called Worley Engineering a few months ago. Worley is one of the world's largest, most reputed engineering companies, engineering procurement construction company, and they have significant expertise, especially when it comes to designing these graphite anode processing facilities. So we started working with them, and then we expect this work to be over before the end of 2023. And then our current planning is the European natural graphite anode plant will come online in 2026, 2027 timeframe. It all depends on the customer qualification and also the financing of the project. But we are definitely committed to Europe as a region, not only because of the geographic presence through the Ukrainian mine, but we also want to forward integrate into the natural graphite anode. So we want to capture all the value into the battery material and keep that value in Europe.
No, that very interesting. So obviously you're going to be focusing very much on the battery, but graphite has got several other opportunities. So we have a question here. Would it be suitable, for example, for the manufacturing of graphene, sort of this new material that people are looking around, or is that not of interest to you particular, but you're just going to be focusing on the battery anodes? I don't know if that's Prashant or Trevor to answer that question.
I'll take a crack and then I'll ask Roman and Trevor to jump in. So yes, graphite has multiple applications, multiple industrial uses, including graphite, refractories, steel manufacturing, you name, all sorts of things. The reason we're focusing on the battery materials is twofold. One is actually today, in fact, starting late 2022, the batteries have become the largest market for graphite materials. So that's the growth. And in fact, if you look into the graphite product breakdown of Ukrainian mine, we believe that it's actually ideal and suitable for the lithium-ion battery applications. And we have tremendous data to back up that claim. That does not mean we're ignoring other applications. In fact, the majority of the sales today are for non-battery applications. But I will let Trevor and Roman elaborate on that.
Mm-hmm. Trevor?
So what I can add that generally Zavalevsky graphite is considered a high quality, and it's known in the world since the big history. And the graphene market is emerging market that's normally done from the graphite, and we already have some inquiries and the potential customers who are willing to buy our graphite for the producing further the graphene. We had some testing in some Poland institutes, which stated that our graphite is suitable for the producing graphene. We already have some inquiries from even Latin America, from Brazil. The last we have the company is interested in our product. So our target, the target of the world, is for sure delivering our graphite for the battery anode market, but that's not eliminates the use of our graphite for other industries.
Okay, that's right. And somebody's just reminded me that the US with their IRA Act is investing enormously into the Green Deal, and apparently is also going to be investing in mining facilities in the United States. Are there going to be opportunities for the European Union to invest in resources like the Zavalevsky? Is this an avenue that you're exploring to see what opportunities for investment subsidies are going to be available in the near future, or is this again an area where the European Union is lagging behind these proposals in the United States?
I can take a crack. And so Yes, the Inflation Reduction Act, which became a law back in August of 2022, is truly a game changer because it provides tremendous amount of both the financial incentives and the legislative support for localization of these clean tech electric vehicle battery industries. Not only that, in fact, prohibits these materials coming from certain countries of foreign countries, entities of concern. So the European Union, I would also say, is doing similar things. If you look at what is happening with ERMA, with EIT, and also EBRD, there are legislative mechanisms which are being put in place to ensure that the industry also grows in Europe and remains competitive.
Right. Now, I think certainly we know about the European Union Critical Raw Materials Act, and I think that's going to be give some absolute opportunities. I'm going to take just a couple more questions if anybody's got anything that they want to put up on the question and answer chat. But whilst I'm doing that and whilst you're doing that, the other thing we haven't talked about is obviously the various supply chain laws that are going to be introduced. So Germany has already introduced its law where manufacturers are going to have to be much more vigilant about their various companies in the supply chain. And obviously, I think a company like Volt Resources, being a publicly quoted company in Australia and in Germany, as we've just heard, is obviously extremely aware, probably much more open than many mining companies are. And just for example, as I was preparing for this webinar, I spotted that on your website you have a very long report, or a very comprehensive report, on environmental and social and governance issues, which is obviously a critical part of the supply chain issues. Trevor, maybe you could say how you are tackling these ESG issues and the various supply chain requirements that are being legislated in Europe and I think in the United States as well.
Yeah, it's as you said, a pretty critical area for all companies, and particularly where you're looking to develop supply chains from basically raw materials, so from source all the way through to the doorstep of an end user, which is either a car OEM who's producing batteries, or a battery manufacturer. So the business model that we're following does require us to make sure that we implement appropriate ESG principles. The document you're referring to is our framework for how Volt will manage its implementation and development of its environmental, social and governance programs. In fact, we're just in the process of implementing a reporting tool so that we can measure our progress along a whole series of criteria which follow the World Economic Forum principles. So it's a pretty full program that we're developing, and the plan is that we implement that at the Volt corporate level, and then that cascades and is implemented down through our different activities. And we mentioned that we've got a project in Tanzania, so that's one area that we'll be implementing those programs, and obviously looking to roll things through into the Zabaleski business as well. So we're committed to doing that. We think it's a key part of our business. I think for all businesses are going to have to look to manage and implement these sort of principles throughout their whole operations. So, managing things like carbon emissions and measuring them and reducing them, and but also things like social investment. Obviously, in some of the jurisdictions we had, the impact on the community in Ukraine that we're in, Zavalia, where the mine's located. As Roman mentioned, there have been conscripted people. We've lost employees to the military service, and some of those people won't come back, obviously. And so, the impact on the township, but the contribution that we can make to, restore and create opportunities in the community through developing Zabaleski and expanding it, but also the same things in Africa, where our mine's located in a very low socioeconomic area. So Mining, while it, gets a fair bit of criticism, because of the activities we're engaged in, but I think, mining creates enormous opportunities and makes, huge differences to the communities that we operate in, and provides tremendous opportunities and benefits.
Yeah. I think that's a really nice aspect, to slowly round this seminar up. I just wonder, Roman, if I could ask you just to give a few final words, your thoughts about how the business is going to go, how Ukraine is going to develop, and how the relationship with the European Union and Australia is going to develop. Just to wrap up this seminar, Roman, if you could say just a few words.
So generally, I'm more than convinced that this year will be the year of the victory of Ukraine, and all the bad stories will be lifted, and we finally could take more investment and to enhance our assets, because Zavalevsky is, just believe me, has a tremendous perspective. So generally, if we speak about the geology, there are four different graphite bearing zones in Ukraine, and Zavalevsky sits within the major graphite bearing zones called the Pobuzhia graphite bearing zone, which is by the name of the river which goes close to the mine. And just for now, the biggest Zavalevsky field accounts for around 100,000 tons of the graphite, but there is still a huge upside potential for the further exploration works on the flanks of the deposit itself, since we are sitting in the center of the big graphite bearing region. So that's not also about Zavalevsky history, that we are producing from the 1934, but it's more about our future, that we can explore and deliver even more graphite to the European Union. The second point is that Zavalevsky is situated geographically in good territory and point of the Ukraine, where it has a lot of the solar radiation, and we have a lot of land, more than 1,000 hectares of the land, so we can install additionally a solar panel station which meets our ESG principles and will enhance our liquidity, will lower our cost, but also will meet ESG levels. The second point is that the river goes close to the mine, and there is yet opportunity to install a hydropower plant for 2 megawatts. So yet we see that in the middle term we have a number of the good projects to develop, which will create an integrated and cumulative effect.
Okay, fine. Thanks very much indeed. Look, for giving us that outlook on some of your plans for the future. Prashant, maybe you'd just like to wrap up this webinar from the side of Volt Resources. I think we've had a fantastic introduction to what you're doing. So Prashant, just a few words on behalf, maybe give a little bit of an outlook on your relationship with Europe in the near future. So over to you, Prashant.
Absolutely. Thank you, Robert. So I think it goes without saying that the rapidly growing electric vehicle, this battery industry is really, truly once in a lifetime opportunity. I don't think it's only for Volt, but several other ASX listed Australian companies. The demand for graphite, lithium, nickel, manganese, cobalt, all these materials, which are the key components of the batteries, will simply grow dramatically. The numbers are anywhere from 20, 25 to 30% CAGR, depending on which material you're looking at. So this is really an opportunity for natural resource companies to transform them into really high margin, high quality businesses, getting into this material production and really becoming a part of this new EV ecosystem. So we definitely are looking forward to working with all the companies in the European continent, all our supply chain partners. So we want to cooperate with them, we want to work with them, we want to learn from them, and we want to make this as a win-win story for everybody.
Thanks very much indeed, Prashant. And I can assure you from the side of the German-Australian Business Council, we want to make this a win-win for you, for the ecosystem. And I think, you can be really proud that your engagement actually with Ukraine. I mean, we saw the way Germany recovered from the devastation of the Second World War by investment from around the world into the German economy. And I think it's the most important thing that we will be doing with the Ukrainian economy once the war is over, hopefully, as Roman has said, in the course of the coming year, to see more investment from Australian companies into the resources, the natural resources of Ukraine, into the opportunities that the Ukraine will offer. And I hope also that we'll be able to keep a lot more of the value within Ukraine and within the European Union. And so it's great to hear about your battery plant. Matthew, thank you very much indeed for helping to arrange this webinar. I just wonder if you'd just like to say a couple more words before I sign off. Just to let you know, we do have a raw materials focus group within the German-Australian Business Council. Those of you who signed up will have been given the opportunity to sign up to our membership of the focus group. It's free of charge for members, obviously, of the German-Australian Business Council and our fellow AB members. So please feel free to get involved. Please, if you've got any ideas of other raw material topics that you would like us to offer, to talk about, do feel free to give your views. We are hoping in the European autumn, so sort of September, October time, to get somebody from the Australian government to also talk about how they see the European Critical Raw Materials Act, as well as hopefully some people from the European Union to talk about this. Matthew, I'll give you the last word. Thank you once again for organising and getting three fantastic speakers to join us. We've been a real privilege to hear Prashant talking about the practical problems, Roman talking about the practical problems, and then from Trevor and Prashant to talk about how they see the future of Volt Resources and their engagement within Europe. So just over to you, Matthew, for the final words. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. And just very quickly, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Robert. I think you did a brilliant job today moderating the session, and thank the GABC, I think, for their passion in the critical raw material space. So we hope to work, closely with you going forward. And thanks, Trevor, Prashant and Roman, for showcasing Volt Resources. I think it's, I just want to echo what Robert said. I think this is an exciting time for Australian companies in the critical raw material space to be engaging with and to connecting with Europe, investors and stakeholders. And I think Volt's doing a fantastic job, and we look forward to continuing to work with the company for a long time. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much indeed. Have a good day.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Matthew.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.